I checked just now what the word valedictory means. I was told it means goodbye. So goodbye. That's the address. But thank you very much indeed for this short opportunity. I won't be long. It does say on our program that there will also be somebody moving a vote of thanks. And so that's not me. But nevertheless, let me start by saying thanks to everybody for coming to this session of the Cape Town conversation. A number of people have remarked about how I've been sitting next to Anand Sharma here for all of the sessions. And I don't know what that means, with a sense of wonder that I've been able to come to all of the sessions. To explain that, it's for me, this is an important school, a school of learning. We talk here about shaping a just global order as a theme of our session. That's a big issue, shaping a just global order. So it was very important for me to listen to everybody answering this important question. Because there's something we need to do, because this assumes, this aspiration of shaping a just global order, it assumes that there is an unjust global order. That's why we give ourselves this task. And so it was very important for me to listen to everybody, all the panelists, as they spoke on the various topics, all of the people, all of us who participated in this, asked questions and made comments to answer what is indeed an important question. So I really want to say thanks a lot to all the panelists, everybody who participated. For me, it's as I was saying, it's part of a process of learning. I will maybe to another day I will say something more about how the teachers have behaved. And one of the challenges has been that some of the teachers are better educated than I am, obviously. So they talk about certain things, and the thing flies over my head. Because there are certain things which they assume I know, which I don't know. For instance, we're talking about, I was asking one of my colleagues around our table there, that when people talk about data, what does that mean? Data, when you say there must be a data center, what would it be in that center? To assume that I know it is wrong. And so you speak very eloquently and in a very educated manner about those data centers. But I don't understand a word of it. I'm saying is that one day I will talk about the quality of our teachers. But really thanks indeed to everybody for coming. I think when we meet next year around this time in the next session of the Cape Town conversation, I think we'll have to keep this topic of shaping a global order. The theme, I think we stay with it. In any case, I think the very fact that there's been a new leadership of the G20 obliges us to keep this theme. Because 12 months hence, I think we'll have to have a look at the global order to see what has happened during the presidency of President Trump of the G20. I'm sure that all of us would remember, many of us, that at the beginning of this year, the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, gave a long interview. It was in January this year. So I read this interview. And what was very striking, and I was very pleased, I actually stood up all by myself and gave Marco Rubio a standing ovation. Because he was saying, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had what he said was unnatural, abnormal, which is a situation of unipolarity. And he said that was not normal. And what was more normal, he said, was multipolarity. That's when I stood up and clapped. That the US Secretary of State would say a thing like that. It was abnormal that you had a situation where the US was the sole global power which could tell everybody what to do, the world policeman. That was not naturally said. What was more normal, as I was saying, he says, was a multipolar world. And then he says, he mentions a number of countries. And he says multipolarity means each one of our countries, these very different poles, do whatever to promote the interests of our countries. He mentioned Chile, said Chile, for instance, and China, and Russia. And then he said there are also some rogue states, mentioned a number of countries, and said what is therefore must be normal for the US was that it must behave like the other countries. No longer be the policeman of the world or policewoman of the world. That's when I sat down in my ovation, because it didn't say each one of us then pursue these national interests in terms of that multipolarity as he understood it, but in the context, within the context of an agreed global agenda. No reference to this UN Charter, no reference to any of that. To all of the evolution that we talked about, which led, for instance, to the birth of World Trade Organization. None of that. But what it meant, it seemed to me, the way that Marco Rubio put this matter was that, therefore, in this world of multipolarity, as he understood it, the United States will pursue its interest according to what it considers to be its interest, guided by no rules. It would set its own rules and do its own thing. Because it would not mention the fact that this multipolarity occurs in the context, for instance, of a system of international law that would be informed by the UN Charter. That institution doesn't exist. And I think that's why they proposed at the close of the G20 summit here in Johannesburg that they would like to attend the last session, the very last session, for the handover. And what all they wanted, in my understanding, was a handover of the gavel, not the outcomes of the G20. Don't want those. We will not participate in those processes and will not come for the outgoing president of the G20 to say, therefore, these are our outcomes. No, keep your outcomes, give me the gavel. So that the G20, they can then redefine it. Not bound in any way by what has happened in terms of the G20 for all of the years of its existence. They will redefine it. I'm saying having openly said don't hand over to us the outcomes of your session. We don't want them. So what is that going to do to the global order? That's why I'm saying, colleagues, that I think we should keep this theme for our next session, shaping a just global order. The current report on the SDGs, it says that only 35% of the targets, the SDG targets, are on track or making moderate progress. We're five years away from 2030. And only 35% of the targets are on track or making moderate progress. And the report says, as I'm sure all of us have seen, I quote, "We face a global development emergency." We face a global development emergency. And I think that characterization is correct. I think when we talk about a just global order, what are the elements of that just global order? I think an important element of that just order would be the achievement of these SDG goals. You can't have a 1/3 realization of the SDG goals and you say that we've got a just global order. I'm saying in breaking down this topic, just global, what are these elements that are required to define this setting as, therefore, now we have a just global order? One of them will have to be this one, which has got to do with leaving nobody behind in terms of socio-economic development and so on. So what is to be done? This figure, 35, won't translate into 85% in 5 years' time, unless you have major capital transfers from the rich to the poor. Can we avoid that? You need these huge investments in order to achieve these targets. And where are the investments going to come from? From where the capital is to where the capital is wanted. How to achieve that? What is it that needs to be done to effect that mobilization? All of us are very familiar with what happened, for instance, with the Marshall Plan, which required capital transfers from the United States. It made its own contribution to the victory against Nazism, but there was no destruction in the US, but destruction in Europe. So, of course, the Americans were very worried because you had a huge communist party in France, you had a huge communist party in Italy, and we were very worried that in terms of that ideological divide, you might have these Western countries shifting towards the Soviet Union. So we must intervene in order to stop that. It's essentially what informed the Marshall Plan, and therefore these capital transfers from the US to Western Europe in order to achieve a particular political objective. I'm sure that our colleagues here from Japan would also tell a similar story about the attention that the US paid to Japan. Again, you see the emergence of a China led by the Communist Party of China. And in that situation, we needed to act in particular ways, which is what, in fact, led the Americans, for instance, to Vietnam. It was this conflict to defeat global communism. But I'm saying that you could understand why the Americans made those major capital transfers to achieve that particular objective. I'm saying in the situation in which we are, where there's a global agreement in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, what should we do to help effect these large capital transfers? Otherwise, these targets of the SDGs are not going to be realized. One of the examples that I've appreciated greatly, two of them in fact, about this matter, is what, I don't know whether the situation persists with regard to the EU. The EU had, maybe has, very, very intelligent regional policy. What is called regional policy. Once the EU said we have a common market, economic market, also took an important and logical decision that we need a common playing field. And therefore, you needed capital transfers from the richer parts of the EU to the poorer parts of the EU. Ireland, Portugal, even elements of the United Kingdom, like in Northern Ireland, in order to make sure that these countries are able to compete on a more equal basis in a common market. I'm saying that required capital transfers. When Deng Xiaoping in China, Chinese Communist Party of China said in open policy, they'd taken a correct decision that China was not going to be able to generate sufficient capital resources on its own to be able to meet its development imperatives. So let's have an open policy. That open policy's essential part of it was to attract private capital into China. And I'm quite certain that part of what, when the Chinese talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, that's part of what they're talking about. Because here's a socialist country which gets developed by private capital. Because they understood very well that you needed these capital transfers into China for China to be able to achieve the development that it required. So what I'm trying to say, colleagues, that when we're saying shape a just global order, even if we just take the matter of the SDG targets, I think the question that we must ask ourselves, what kind of actions do we need to take? What kinds of actions does the world need to take to generate the resources to invest such that you do indeed achieve these SDGs by 2030? So I'm saying even just the history of the EU, how the EU handled the matter of making sure that the poorer members were able to develop and therefore compete on a more even basis within a common market, they understood very well that you've got to take some resources, capital from the richer countries of the EU to the poorer ones to help them to develop. That's the same message that we have with regard to achievement of these SDGs. What is it that we do to encourage the movement of those capital resources so that indeed these SDGs can be achieved, and therefore we take a step forward towards achieving this just global order? You know, in the last year of survival of the Organization of African Unity was 2001. It was succeeded in 2002 by the African Union. So one of the last major decisions taken by the Organization of African Unity was what became called NEPAD, the New Africa Development Program. The OAU, Organization of African Unity, was formed in 1963 when 32 independent African states came together, formed this. And one of the tasks of the union was to achieve to this African development, to overcome this legacy of colonialism and slavery and so on. You had at some point of what was called the Lagos Plan of Action, a very detailed program as to what to do with the African economy so that we achieve this socio-economic development. But the truth of the matter is that in reality, what the continent united around was its struggle to end colonialism and apartheid. Real unity to say we must end colonialism and apartheid on the continent. Not so much on this socio-economic development until the liberation of South Africa. That's why the new economic development of Africa, NEPAD, becomes possible. Because South Africa has been liberated, so now we've done that job. We can now attend to this one. So the continent, in the end, agreed to this National Economic NEPAD as a continental development program. Not only economic elements, but peace and security, democracy, all of these things. And as we were working on that program, we decided that we should introduce it to particularly the developed world. To say to them, the continent is working on this development program. And when it's done, we would like you, the developed world, to interact with the continent on the basis of that program. We as Africans will have said, this is what we want to make of our continent, and we want you to regulate your own relations with us consistent with that plan. So we went around the world wandering, introducing this thing. And the G8, I remember 2001, thereabouts, was going to meet in Japan. We went and met these G8, G7 countries in Tokyo to introduce this to them. The European Council was meeting in Portugal. We went there to talk to them, to say this is what we're doing. When we finish, we're going to come back to you, and you people must fashion your own relations with the continent consistent with this new African program. And cut a long story short, the G8 met in Canada in 2002 and adopted what was called the G8 Africa Action Plan. A very, very good plan. The Prime Minister of Canada at the time was a very good man, Jean Chrétien. Actually came to the continent twice to discuss with us as to Canada is hosting the G8 summit. We are going to discuss this. How do we relate to this Africa program as you people have demanding? So in the end, I'm saying the G8 Africa Action Plan was adopted in Canada in 2002. One of the matters that was agreed was that there must be because we as Africa have got NEPAD, and the G8 has got what became the G8 Africa Action Plan. They're very related. And that we must therefore have a system of what was called mutual accountability. Consequence of that was that then the there would be an African delegation that would attend all G8 meetings to effect this mutual accountability. So they would give a report. This is what we have done with regard to the implementation of the G8 Africa Action Plan. And would say, this is what we have done with regard to the implementation of NEPAD. What do we do, and so on. So that started the process. But I don't want to be too long about this. The next, when the G8 next met in Canada was 8 years later, 2010. So I spoke to the African political leaders at the time. We're going to attend that G8 summit in Canada. And said to them, my suggestion to you colleagues is make sure that on the agenda of the G8 summit, this item must occur. An assessment of where we are with regard to the G8 Africa Action Plan that was adopted in Canada 2002. Because we could see that something was happening that was not quite right. And the consequence of that was that the host government refused, completely refused, that the item of a decision of the G8 8 years earlier should be discussed. The G8 Africa Action Plan disappeared. So the structured process of interaction between Africa and the developed world disappeared. You've still got a peculiar phenomenon today that you still have African governments attending the meetings of the G7. It's slimmed down by one, it's now G7. And these African brothers and sisters of mine, they go to G8, to G7 summits when there's nothing to discuss. Nothing. But habit, because we've had this thing for, but because the G8 Africa Action Plan disappeared, the developed countries refused. They were saying that this notion of mutual accountability with these Africans is wrong. I'm saying, mention these things, colleagues, to say the task, we must then answer this question. What is it that we do practically to shape a just global order? I'm talking about certain elements of it, part of what has happened, which explain the challenge that we have in terms of achieving this, and practically what has happened. We discussed quite correctly just energy transition. So I listened to this and I was saying to myself, but what does this mean for us on the continent? In the last few years, Uganda has discovered big reserves of oil and gas, Tanzania same, Mozambique same, South Africa same, Namibia the same, Ghana the same, Cote d'Ivoire, so many countries. And so you come to us and you say, you've discovered all these huge reserves of fossil fuels, but please just transit, forget about them, windmills. Even these concepts of correct ones, common but differentiated responsibilities, those concepts disappear through the window. Because, so I look at this thing and I say, but How do these Europeans come to the continent and say to Uganda, to Kenya, to Mozambique, we've heard the story about what you've discovered, but forget about them. Solar energy, windmills. It's not going to happen. It can't. This country is faced with a big challenge. Maybe 90% of our electricity comes from coal-fired power stations. The same demand, just energy transition. We've shut down one coal-fired power stations because of that. It's been retired and transformed into one of these renewable energy things. I've seen a report by the electricity company which says that when that power station was operating at full capacity, it was producing 1,000 megawatts of electricity. Now they've converted it now into solar or something. I think it's solar. It's producing a fifth of 200 megawatts. So your just transition has reduced the capacity to generate electricity. And you know, there's a province here, the Northern Cape, where everybody says this would be the best place, one of the best places for the windmills, and even the big farms for solar panels and so on to generate this electricity. The challenge with regard to that, scientifically that's correct. You need to build the grid to bring that electricity to the areas of human settlements. The cost of it, of building the grid, is higher than the cost of building those generating stations. The consequence of which, for instance, is I know of one area in the country where they've got some big development, and we're going to use renewable energy, which are going to be generated for somewhere else in the country. And that particular company which wanted to do something in one of the provinces were told that you'll have to wait until 2032 before electricity comes from this renewable source. Because the grid is not there, doesn't exist, to bring the electricity from wherever it's generated to these populated areas. But the South Africans, where we are, the developed world said, we want to assist you with this just transition, and we commit these billions of dollars to help you. The problem with that is billions of dollars as loans. So we must acquire dollar-denominated loans in order to achieve this just energy transition. It doesn't make sense. In terms of the development challenges of the continent, I'm saying that even concepts which are very normal in the context of all this discussion about the climate, common but differentiated responsibilities, that vanishes. The differentiated part disappears. Then you have common responsibilities. I'm saying all these things, colleagues, in order to say, in the context of this objective, a just global order, we've got to answer the question, practically, what is it that we do in order to achieve that? And our prescriptions cannot be wrong, you can't make a wrong prescription in order to cure a disease. So, many years ago, 2010, the 2010 G20 summit was held in South Korea, Democratic Republic of Korea. An important document was adopted there. It was called the Seoul the City, Development Consensus for Shared Growth. That arose from the discussion of the response to the 2008-2009 global financial crisis. That crisis would impact in a particular way on the developing countries, and therefore you needed this, what then emerged as the Seoul Development Consensus for Shared Growth, the particular program to address the developing countries. It was done. It was adopted in Seoul in Korea and died there. So the commitment that was made by the G20 for development, for shared growth, and here's a definite program. You won't find it in the declaration that is issued. There's no reference to it. So I'm saying that commitment that was made even by the G20 about development in terms of the developing countries in the context of that crisis, that commitment ceased to exist. So what do we do? Now, it would seem to me that, let me say, one of the things that a person like myself can't run away from is that we come from, we're products of a liberation struggle. At some point in terms of our own struggle here, the world responded in a particular way to the struggle that was taking place here. And you had a global anti-apartheid movement, which was everywhere in the world and truly global. The peoples of the world took on this responsibility to say, this crime against humanity is offensive to all of us as human beings, and it must come to an end. Those of us who are old enough would recall that this was also during the same period that you had this intense struggle in Vietnam. So a very, very strong Vietnam solidarity movement developed. But the anti-apartheid movement was even stronger than the Vietnam solidarity movement. I'm saying the world took on a responsibility. It said, this is a crime against humanity, and it's our common responsibility as human beings to respond. I'm saying that, colleagues, in order to say this, can we not go back there and say this just global order is as important to the people of Southern Africa and Africa, of Asia, as it is important to the people of the United States? The Europeans, this just global order. It's a matter of common consent to all of us. I'm saying whether you are in New York or Johannesburg or Delhi or wherever you are, to the masses of the people, it's not possible for us in saying we are really shaping a just global order. Let's find a way of inspiring the whole world to pursue this. In that context, a question that Redefine here and myself will have to answer. What does the African continent do to help shape this just global order? We have to look at ourselves to say, are we in a fit position as a continent? I don't think we are. And there are certain things that we've got to do about the African continent, about ourselves, to make an impact on this just global order that we need. And I'm saying the next Cape Town conversation must help us to answer that question. What are these practical things that we need to do to mobilize the rest of the world to address this common good? That this just global order is a common good, common to all humanity. It's not just Global South. So, but the answer to the question, what is to be done, is not easy. It's not easy in part because it demands an understanding of objective reality. The world as it is, not as the world as we wish it to be. I was giving this very simple example. You can't come back to the African continent and say to all of us, we've got all of these new discoveries of huge deposits of oil and gas. You can't come to us and say, forget all of that for the just transition. It won't happen. So I'm saying that part of the task of ensuring that we do the necessary mobilization to get the whole world to address this common good of shaping a just global order, it requires an understanding of the objective world. Understanding from us as Africans to pose the question to ourselves as Africans. What is the role of the African continent in shaping a just global order? It's not just a speech by Thabo Mbeki that's going to achieve this. Certain things that we as Africans must do, and in the context of which we must understand our own objective reality properly. Not deceive ourselves about ourselves, but to say, these are our weaknesses and so on, this is what we need to do. It is possible. I think it is possible. It is possible for us to mobilize the peoples of the world, our own countries, our own continents, the peoples of the world, to pursue this common goal, to shape a just global order. And I think it's in the interest of all human beings, whether they are in the West or the East or the North or the South. It's a common objective, can be achieved. But it's the task of this conversation. It's the task of this conversation for us to say at the end of the next session, we've got a much better idea of what it is that must be done to achieve this common goal. And I do hope we'll come back here next year determined to address this matter. So that we shouldn't say, we met for 2 days, 3 days, whatever, had 15 panels or 20 panels. What did we discuss? What did we agree? Is there a view? Is there something that we can communicate to the world, which is going to take the world from where it is today to what it ought to be tomorrow? Can we say that? We must be able to say that at the end of the next session. I trust that we will all have this reflection in order to come out in that manner. But in the meantime, thanks indeed for everybody for coming, and a safe journey home. Thanks a lot.